Good afternoon, and welcome to the second panel of our conference on the Jesuits and global impact. As you know, we'll be looking at Jesuit universities and education for global citizenship. My name's Tom Banchoff. I think I know most of the folks here in the room. I'm the Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown, but also serve as a professor in the School of Foreign Service. And it's, in that context, especially delightful to have the opportunity to reflect with you on the school, its legacy, and its future trajectory as a valued part of our Georgetown community. I also want to thank at the outset our colleague and friend, Father Antonio Spadaro, for hosting us here at La Civita Cattolica. This is turning into a great partnership that we look to deepen in the months and years to come. So I'll introduce my colleagues here in a second. Joel already, in a way, introduced the topic of the panel, which really builds on your conversation earlier this afternoon. We're going to broaden our lens from SFS and Georgetown even more in a comparative direction to look at the experience of Jesuit universities, institutions of higher education around the world, and the promise, but also some of the challenges facing the global Jesuit network and tackling some of the global challenges we've been discussing. Let me begin now with a brief introduction. You have fuller introductions in the program, but just to give you a sense of who's with us today to deepen our reflection on these issues. Father Danny Villanueva is a Spanish Jesuit who currently serves as Executive Vice President at Interculturas and Fe y Alegría, which is an international Jesuit NGO. And Father Danny is also a member of our Georgetown Board of Directors. And next to him, many of you will recognize our colleague, Ambassador Milan Verveer, who's the Executive Director of Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and who under the Obama administration served as the first U.S. Ambassador for Global Women's Issues. And to her left and to my right, Father Agbonkian Miege Orobitor, a Jesuit from Nigeria who serves as president of the Conference of Major Superiors of Africa and Madagascar, and is also a member of the Georgetown Board of Directors. So we have a great group here to deepen the reflection on the Jesuits and global impact, and with a specific focus on global citizenship. So first, please join me in welcoming our panel. Yeah. So I'll take the privilege of the chair and provide some framing remarks, again, building off the conversation this morning, and addressing some of the themes in a wider perspective that I know my colleague, Jose Casanova, will deepen in his keynote. The first point is an obvious one, I think, that from the founding of the society, its mission was both the spreading of the gospel and the service to the common good. And we want to zero in here on the role of Jesuit universities, Jesuit higher education, in that wider mission, historically, but especially today. I can't resist quoting from a letter from St. Ignatius, many of you may know, from 1551, which is just around the time that Gregorian University, our partner here in Rome, and the first Jesuit university to be founded and directed by the society, had its beginnings. In 1551, Ignatius wrote, with an eye to the purpose of Jesuit education, quote, "From among who are at present merely students, in time some will depart to play diverse roles. One to preach and carry on the care of souls, another to the government of the land and the administration of justice, and others to other occupations." So this idea that Jesuit education is an education for service and citizenship, what we might call today global citizenship, we'll be coming back to that, can be traced back centuries. It was lived out, for example, in the middle of the 18th century when the Jesuit Global Network reached its full dimensions, some 700 colleges and universities around the world. It persisted during the 19th century after the restoration of the society in an era of nationalism and colonialism. This idea of the common good and service to the wider society was strong, was embedded within Jesuit education, although one must say also constrained by the nationalism of the time. It's really only been since World War II and the shock of that war that the promise of a more global orientation within the society and its institutions of education, higher education, has been really fulfilled. And in a way, the Walsh School was at this intersection in 1919. We often reflect on the fact that it's a school of foreign service. It's an American institution, still today in many ways. But from the start, coming out of that era of nationalism, had a global horizon that was spoken of in very articulate terms by Edmund Walsh and discussed earlier today. A global orientation that looked forward to the post-war era and the breakout role of Father Pedro Arrupe as Superior General of a society beginning in 1965, who in the wake of Vatican II led the Jesuits as a kind of avant-garde, if you like, within the church toward a greater embrace of intercultural dialogue, toward a greater embrace of social justice. And there are a couple markers here I think worth remembering as context for our discussion. One is a very famous address that I think we all know in one way or another of Pedro Arrupe in 1973 to an international alumni gathering in Valencia, entitled Men for Others. Today we would translate that as Women and Men for Others. The subtitle is also interesting and also very, very forward-looking. Training Agents of Change for the Promotion of Justice. When I reread that, I was struck by the phrase agents of change, which I would have thought had become a term of use much more recently. But there it was back in 1975. So that speech is a touchstone, an inspiration for a wider global approach to issues of social justice and citizenship as a product of Jesuit education. And of course, this importance of justice was laid down officially as the policy, as a priority of society in 1975, with the twin mission to serve the faith and promote justice around the world. Again, if we look back from where we are, the global challenges we discussed this morning, it's interesting to note that already in the 1970s, Pedro Arrupe was talking about what he called at the time Jesuit Internationalism, which he also traced back to Ignatius and his global horizon. And this, in his words, incorporated not only a willingness to go around the world and serve wherever one is, but to address the global issues of our time explicitly, to make those a priority of the society and of its educational institutions. He said that, quote, universal problems that affect the whole globe have to be considered a top priority in the society's mission. This is 40 years ago. And at that time, the problems identified are the problems we're wrestling with today: poverty, migration, humanitarian disasters, and civil strife. And this was the era, as Tom Smolich so eloquently described, of the formation of the Jesuit Refugee Service as a response to the crisis of the Vietnamese boat people. And since then, at SFS, at Georgetown, and across the global network of Jesuit universities, you can see the effort to embed the study of these global issues within our institutions growing over time in the curriculum and the co-curriculum. We discussed this morning the importance of practice, getting out there through study abroad, global experiences, as well as an interdisciplinary study of issues ranging from migration and poverty to, of course, a current concern with climate change. If you look at some of the numbers, it's very difficult to determine just how big the Jesuit network is, because the definition of an institution of higher education, complex to begin with, is extremely complicated in the Jesuit context, where you've got colleges and universities and all kinds of different social institutes. But we tend to think of about 200 institutions who fit that mold. And we've done a survey of just the programs, the degrees, the majors, the minors that are offered across the global network. And it's quite exciting, really, to see the range of global issues that are embedded within the academic core of universities. For example, some 30 or more programs on human rights, 40 on justice and peace issues, and more than 50 on environmental issues, especially issues of environmental justice. And we build this on an older tradition of professional education embedded in Jesuit universities like Georgetown. There's some 30 law schools around the world, some 30 medical schools run by the Jesuits, as well as more than 60 business schools. What distinguishes the Jesuits from other universities grappling with these global issues is a challenge, and so maybe something we need to look at, because we live in an era where every institution, from the smallest community college to the biggest state or national university, claims to be, is committed to the education of global leaders, global citizens. One topic I want to throw out for discussion, we may come back to in the conversation with you, is what is the Jesuit difference? And I think there are two ways to approach that here at the outset. One is to look at something we touched on, but I think deserves a little deepening, the humanistic tradition of education at Jesuit institutions. The fact that at Georgetown, SFS students have been safe from science, but theology and philosophy have been and continue to be a core part of the curriculum. And one could go a little bit deeper and insist that at this moment of globalization, and this is something that Father Nicolas, the predecessor to the current Father General, Father Sosa, mentioned in an important speech to Jesuit educators back in 2010 in Mexico City. This was the same speech where he coined the term the globalization of superficiality, insisting on an education not just about the facts of global challenges, but a moral education, even a character education, to promote the formation of critical thinkers, self-reflective individuals who would feel a calling to go out and make a positive difference in the world in addressing some of these issues. Not just an understanding, but a calling to see themselves as true global citizens. And Danny, in his reflections, is going to bring us up to date on some of the thinking within the society about global citizenship. There's also been a further evolution in the range of issues and ideas. I already mentioned the climate change has been added to the traditional list of global concerns that one can trace back to Father Arupe. And Milan is going to take us through the critical importance of women's rights as human rights, gender equity and gender equality as a challenge for Jesuit education and as an important global issue that we need to grapple with going forward. In conclusion, I want to say something about the network as a whole, because often we talk about this network that I've just described as a panacea. Oh, we have this network, we should be doing more. We haven't done enough. This is a moment of reflection, of discernment, where we can and should do more, and SFS and Georgetown are trying to contribute to that wider conversation. But it's worth thinking about why that is. Why not more collaboration? And I want to just throw out three ideas very quickly. One is the decentralized nature of Jesuit institutions. One of the geniuses of the society is this decentralized nature around the world, the way it corresponds to and responds to local circumstances. Same is true of our universities. They're very good in local context, not as good at engaging in collaboration with one another. A second issue is diversity, the simple diversity of the network, the range of local and national and regional challenges that the schools face. They're very different contexts they're embedded in, whether cultural, religious, or political. And Father Bator is going to share some thoughts, in particular on the African context, which is very different from the context facing the United States, Europe, or other regions of the world. The third challenge, besides decentralization and diversity, is the most sensitive, and I would call it, I guess this is my political science side coming through, an asymmetry of power and resources across the network. There's some institutions like Georgetown which are simply blessed with more resources than others. It's a wonderful thing for Georgetown. I think it imposes, and Jack is very eloquent on this, obligations on us to do more, to support the network more broadly. But it does, I would argue, make it difficult to collaborate fully as equals at a psychological and a substantive procedural level. It's not something we can and must do. It's difficult, but I think we have to acknowledge some of that difficulty. So the asymmetry within the network is also perhaps a reason we haven't achieved our full potential over time. These are things we can wrestle with together going forward. We're making great progress. Many of you know Father General Sosa convened a meeting of university presidents in Bilbao last year. We founded the International Association of Jesuit Universities, and SFS and Georgetown are part of the discernment going on within that body about how we can build a more effective network to address these global issues together, take full advantage of the blessings we have. And as Joel said, it really is an unparalleled network. You can't point to any other network of higher education with the same potential, and I emphasize potential. So those are just some framing remarks which I hope will lead into our conversation here. And with that, let me turn it over to Danny for some thoughts.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, thank you, Antonio, for hosting us, and Civiltad, and Jack. Thank you to Georgetown. I think you are an amazing platform for enhancing the Jesuit mission, and these conversations are just opening up opportunities for the future, as I'm going to argue is one of the key elements of the moment of the society nowadays. I think that Matt Carnes, in his initial presentation when he talked about the universal apostolic preferences, he was highlighting what I love to call a process of developing a corporative sense of mission that has been happening in the last few years. For many years, we had just the formula of the Institute in the Society of Jesus since 1540, and only in the last few years, since the 70s, is when we started to formulate that we can have a way of saying what we do together. Huh? And these ones, the UAP, actual ones that Matt exposed to us, is the third time that we are expressing what we want to do as a global network of institutions, as a body, as an apostolic body. So I want to highlight that at the same time there is a parallel process that is as important as this conceptualization of the mission, that is this progressive awareness of the internationality, the globality, and the multiculturality in our apostolic body. This was not always there, and you will be surprised, but only in the 1939, I think, is the first time that in our documents appeared this idea that we should be working beyond provinces. And it is in 1949 when the Father General in that time, Janssens, he said, the Society of Jesus could do incredible things only if we act in a spirit of oneness. And you can trace up to today this worry in our Father Generals that they are always bringing us to a more universal approach and also a more universal way of implementing the mission. I always say we are very good at enculturation. We are not as good as international cooperation among us. This is something very interesting because we tend to idealize the global network of the Society of Jesus, and we are quite new on this trend. Actually, I think it was Kolbenbach in 1990, he was saying, we are still not using the potential of our international body. And in 1995, that's GC 34, we have the main basic elements of networks already in that congregation, in Decree 23. I really recommend it. And in that decree, they say we need networks, global and regional networks, to develop our mission, and we don't know how. It says we should proceed through trial and error. This is 1995. And it's incredible because it's in 2000 when these all new initiatives on the international stage start to come up. Actually, the Jesuit Refugee Service, this is 1980, I think is the first global approach to answer a global challenge. It's Arrupe, the one who thinks we are especially well suited to answer the challenge of the refugees, and it cannot be answered through the provinces. We need to create a different structure, and he creates the GRS. So I think this is very interesting because in the last 10 years, all the apostolic secretaries of the society, higher ed, secondary and pre-secondary ed, and the social apostolate, have been creating global networks in an unprecedented way. All the global meetings that we have had have been about collaboration and networking. The three big apostolate sectors, they have three platforms, digital platforms, to contribute to these new ideas and contribute to these joint ventures at the international level. Just 1 month ago, we were finishing here in Rome one of the task forces working for Father General exactly on governance through networks. And we are worried about how to do it. And for that task, we identified, in this moment, we have 80 networks linked to the Jesuit mission, international ones, not provincial ones. Most of them created in the last 15 years. So this is quite new. And the point I want to make here is that the networks for us in this moment are an apostolic opportunity. We really believe that the future of the Society of Jesus is not about creating new institutions. It's about a creative combination of the ones that are already working. That's why we think that networks are not operational structure, are actually opportunities to channel this new culture of collaboration and collective action that is opening up new opportunities for the future of the society. That's why some of us are all the time saying the organizational question is an apostolic one. That's why in the GC36, networking appears together with discernment and collaboration. And the three of them are the three angles to understand this new way of proceeding. It's incredible. The same thing that the UAPs are the answer to the question, what is that we can do together? Discernment, collaboration, and networking are the answer to the question, how are we going to do it? And we are wiring the apostolic body as we speak. That's why these type of meetings are so important, and the role of the SFS could be incredibly good. We are creating the connections that are going to open up new apostolic opportunities into the future. And let me insist, our expertise is not in the global. Our DNA, it is in the global. Our mission is universal, but we are specialists in enculturation, and we are little by little getting to balance that. And that is what I think is the key issue of global citizenship. Because this fact of being in so many places and so many cultures is giving us the perfect framework to train men and women for others in this new global and complex context. We really believe that all institutions today are trying to train people to thrive in this multicultural context, being able of thinking and acting local and globally without feeling that this is an impossible dichotomy. People able of recognizing in the other an equal in dignity and rights that is so important today, right? Able of understanding themselves as part of a bigger framework than their own lives and their own selves. This is what we call global citizenship. And for this, the key is understanding diversity as an opportunity, as a constitutive dimension of human life, not as a problem, not as a problem. That's what I think that we need to balance enculturation with multiculturalism, this kind of joyful recognition of the diversity of cultures, and also with this idea of interculturality that is a kind of a challenge to grow and to enrich my own perspective through the constructive engagement and conversation with other cultures. I think it was GC 35 when they sent us to the frontiers of cultures and religions to find, identify, and engage in conversation with others. This is now exactly happening as we speak. So, and I'm going to finish before Tom just flagged me because of the time, but it's not by chance that now, in this moment, the two big networks, higher ed and secondary ed, they have task forces trying to develop the concept of global citizenship. You are leading one of them. And it's very interesting also that the two big networks of education at the frontiers, as I call them, that is the Jesuit Refugee Service and Fe y Alegría, the one I work with, we are also part of those conversations because we believe that we are training people, refugees in Kakuma camp in northwest Kenya, and indigenous population in the Amazonian forest in Peru, because of the very same reason that we are training students in Spain or in Philippines or youth in Georgetown or the Gregorian. We are providing frameworks of understanding the complexity of our reality. We are helping the people to make sense of our own place in creation and society. Education is our theory of change. And we really believe that through education is how we are shaping, accompanying, empowering the future agents of change that are going to somehow build up the future social matrix of the world. And through global citizenship, I think is the only way we can be sure that that future is going to be sustainable, is going to be just, and is going to be peaceful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elaine?
Well, let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you to the Jesuits and thank you to Georgetown, because both have had a profound influence on my life, for which I continue to be very grateful. And to have the chance to come here today and be part of this discussion. One of the key issues confronting our world, one that I think the School of Foreign Service recognized very early, has to do with the participation of women on these great issues of the day with which we are still struggling. Since we are observing this 100th anniversary, I think it's worth pointing out that several years before Georgetown opened the college to women, the School of Foreign Service opened itself for women's participation in the curriculum of the school. Now, in truth, they were small in numbers, there was a quota, but I think Georgetown School of Foreign Service was demonstrating back then that women have a critical role to play on the international issues of our times, and their service is critically needed. So again, ahead of its time in some ways. I think we need to look no further than the Sustainable Development Goals that were promulgated by the United Nations, setting a development agenda for the world on what we need to achieve, an agenda that was adopted by consensus, that much of the world is focused on. I know the Jesuits have been studying it and trying to determine how the society can work in terms of those goals. Because today there is a recognition like never before, a recognition from scholarship and experience and practice that it is a necessity to unleash the God-given potential of women on addressing the challenges of our time, whether they have to do with governance, have to do with climate, have to do with the economy, with peace, with any of the major challenges. We are not going to achieve those goals without unleashing the full potential of half the population of the world, much of which is still marginalized. And I think that is something we need to bear in mind. In developing the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the key goals is gender equality and the empowerment of women. Now, it's clearly an important goal in and of itself, but it's also increasingly recognized that none of the other goals, whether they have to do with poverty alleviation, have to do with health, education, climate, hunger, can be achieved without that goal of women's equality and empowerment also being necessary in terms of the other goals being achieved. So placing this in a place of necessity, I think, is something that we no longer are grappling with as maybe that nice thing we'll do if we can get to it, but one that's absolutely critical to the shared goals that we have in addressing these issues. Now, one of the tangible expressions of how this integration of gender works, how it matters, I think, is in the School of Foreign Service today. Perhaps the infant in these 100 years, but the Institute for Women, Peace, and Security recognizes the intrinsic role that women have to play in peace and security issues. This comes from the United Nations Security Council, which more than 2 decades ago recognized that the agency of women is linked to peace and security. Now, we haven't done collectively in terms of political decision makers, in terms of multilateral institutions, in terms of peacemaking, the implementation of that, but it continues to be our goal. And why is that important? Well, it's important from a number of contexts and perspectives. One is prevention. If we want to prevent conflict, one of the key things we must do is look at the condition of women. Because women are like the canaries in the mines, and where they are beset with oppression, with the denial of their rights, those societies, and research increasingly demonstrates this, are more prone to conflict, more prone to instability. We at the Institute have developed an index, the first ever Women, Peace, and Security Index, a comprehensive index that ranks more than 150 countries on the well-being of women. It's important to peace and security, that's the association. But it's a different kind of index because we not only look at inclusion, how are women doing in the economy, how are they doing in terms of political participation, in terms of education, as we look at justice, where are the discriminatory practices, what's impeding unleashing their potential, and at security. Because if they are prone to violence, if they are abused, if they aren't safe in their communities, a girl, for example, who may have the ability to become educated is not going to really fulfill the benefits of that education if she isn't safe going to school or isn't safe when she's in school. So the condition of women matters, and we know in societies where men and women are more equal, where the gaps between them is not enormous, those societies are far more peaceful and stable. Another way that we look at peace and security and the role of women is that women bear much of the burden of some of the civil conflicts that are engulfing our world today. It is the top of the agenda for many of the armed combatants the world over to focus on women, and sexual violence is one of the critical ways that that is done. It is the weaponization of women. It is a tool, a concerted strategy to achieve their goals. And yet impunity in terms of reparations, in terms of prosecutions, in terms of the whole justice mandate is missing for the most part. And so that is a big part of the world conversation today. How do we repair the situation that women are undergoing? Thirdly, it has to do with participation. Now, more than half of the peace agreements that are adopted and have been adopted in the last many years end in the first 5 years of their adoption in terms of when these agreements are signed, sealed, and delivered. And very few women are engaged in that process, either as mediators, as negotiators, as signatories to these agreements. And yet what we know from a lot of the work we're doing at Georgetown and from many other sources is that they play a vital role based on the experience that they have in those societies, but also when they do reach the table, they are the ones who put human rights on the agenda, put reconciliation on the agenda, justice issues on the agenda, economic opportunity on the agenda. You can't bridge divides. We've been talking a lot about polarization and divides. You can't bridge those divides, reach across communities, unless you have people at the table who understand why it's so critically important. And not just the combatants on both sides whose interest it is to get the best deal that they can for themselves. And most conflicts are recurring conflicts. So we've not solved these problems in the first place. And certainly in recovery, in reconstruction, in moving from conflict to peace, hopefully sustainable peace, that is a critical place again for women's participation in terms of building institutions, in terms of governance, in terms of creating economic opportunity, in terms of the humanitarian efforts that are going to transition that society. So it is a very compelling piece of the peace agenda to understand the role that women have in all of that work. Let me just mention climate in that context, because climate, the international community, has put climate on the peace and security agenda for obvious reasons. That is going to be the source of the next wars. Already we're seeing water shortages, we're seeing the depletion of natural resources, we're seeing agricultural livelihoods ending, the prospect of more and more battles over the shortages and conditions, lack of arable land, et cetera, that climate is creating, we must really understand and address. Now, it's true, women are the most vulnerable in terms of climate impacts, but that's not where the conversation should begin and end, because women are vital to adaptation and to mitigation. They're already demonstrating around the world what they're doing in terms of conservation, what they're doing in terms of renewables, in terms of installing on a massive scale clean cook stoves, which are the way hundreds of thousands of people cook around the world, and it spews carbon, black carbon, into the environment. Any of us going into those situations are finding our eyes watering and we can't even swallow. These issues have to be addressed, and they are critical to addressing them, which is why we at the Institute are working very collaboratively on this issue with other institutions, but it's also why COP24, this is the series of UN efforts on climate that are happening annually and obviously beyond and within the formal meetings, have put gender and climate on the agenda and created gender action plans. It's one thing to create frameworks. They're very good. The language is perfect. Lots of good thought goes into it. It's the practice. It's what comes out of them and what gets developed. So climate is a big piece of this gender integration. And let me just mention one more area that is reflective, that is reflective of this space. And that is the whole social development, economic opportunity issue. Because what we know today, incontrovertibly, in fact, there's more research on this than just about anything in terms of women's participation, and that is how women's economic participation grows economies, creates jobs, enhances inclusive prosperity, closing these disparities, inequality disparities. And one area, just to make the point on how this plays out in terms of poverty issues and hunger issues and sustainability economic issues, is agriculture. The great majority of women in many places, they are in the majority in some countries, is in agriculture. They are the smallhold farmers. What we know is that they don't have the same access to resources. In fact, the FAO, the UN headquarters is here in Rome, did a major study on women as a vital force in agriculture. Now, why did they do this study? Because it was important to demonstrate that where this gap between women and their male counterparts in agriculture is closer to being closed, in tools of agriculture, in terms of the kinds of resources they need, training, and most importantly, in land, they become more productive. In fact, it's calculated by 2.5% to 5% more productivity. And here is the really key issue. 150 million more people would be fed if women's productivity went up in agriculture. So I've just scratched the surface. The stakes are enormous. I think we belong in this space. This is what our values call us to. And we cannot begin to address our common cause our shared values, unless women have the same opportunity as men do to influence the development of their societies at all levels.
Thank you very much. Father Bator?
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
I didn't mean for that to be the grand finale, but
Thanks, Tom, for the invitation. And thanks to Antonio for the hospitality. Just a brief disclaimer that this woolly cap is not a fashion statement. It's providing some extra layer for post-surgical head wound that I'm still nursing, but I'm okay. My brief is to focus very briefly on the challenges of Jesuit higher education from the perspective of the developing world, but particularly from the context of Africa, and how higher education can have more positive impact in training citizens and leaders. And coming to this event and reflecting on this event, the centennial celebration of the Walsh School of Foreign Service, it's something that filled and evoked deep emotions in me. I believe emotions of pride, but also of unease in equal measure. I'm convinced that any institution that has consistently delivered a string of stellar performance as SFS has over a century, justly and fittingly deserves all the accolades and has the right to celebrate as we are doing here today. I, for one, and Danny would be my colleague, my partner in this, I'm a proud beneficiary of the accomplishment of SFS through the Global Executive MBA program that we both participated in. But again, I cannot, as it were, shake up this uncanny realization that we are celebrating an achievement that will be considered an unattainable, impossible dream in the part of the world where I come from. Danny was talking about citizenship, and Tom mentioned the speech that the Superior General of the Jesuits gave in Bilbao last year, where he also talked about citizenship. And Father Arturo Sosa has said that citizenship, and I would add to that leadership, involves identifying with something that is greater than the self, something that is more encompassing, more than the individual's own interests, which he says are always partial and narrow. And I agree. And speaking of training and formation for civic engagement, or training and formation of leaders, citizens and leaders for global engagement, I have come to the conviction that, at least in the case of the developing countries on the continent of Africa, that the greatest challenge facing these countries is the deficit in leadership, or what some people have called the leadership gap. If I could use biblical imagery, I would say it is the root of all our evil. And Tom has pointed out, and Danny as well has pointed out, that the institutions of higher education are a privileged and unique means for responding to this challenge, fulfilling this gap. And I think that is absolutely true. Again, speaking of training citizens and forming leaders for global engagement, in and through higher education, I would have to say that this objective is also seriously constrained by several factors in the developing world, and Tom has just mentioned one, which is the asymmetry of power and resources. Just to put it in context, in demographic terms, Africa is projected to represent by 2050 18% of the global Jesuit population and 25% of the global Christian tradition. Now, when you look at this hopeful forecast of a flourishing church and a flourishing society of Jesus in Africa, you'd have to say that it contrasts very sharply with the fact that on this continent, there is not a single functional Jesuit university. And across the continent, if you look at the public university, there are only 3 public universities that are internationally ranked in the world. Now, what this means, this situation means, at the very least, is that we are well far from achieving the objective of forming citizens and leaders for global engagement through the means of higher education for a continent of more than 1 billion people. So, taking all this into consideration, let me just make 3 points. The first is that, as Danny has mentioned, I am convinced that there is no better means, no more effective means of preparing people, especially young people, to become engaged citizens and leaders in their communities, in their nations, and in the world than higher education. And the developing world is full of young people. The second point for me is that I'm also convinced that, especially in the context of the continent of Africa, that the next frontier of Jesuit mission is the development and advancement of higher education. And as we speak, there are new and fledgling initiatives. About a year ago, we got approval to start the Arupe Jesuit University in Harare, Zimbabwe, and the year before that, University of Loyola in the Congo. These are new, and they are still at their infancy. But talking about network, I also think that they deserve the support and the benefit of this 450-year-plus old network of Jesuit education, particularly Jesuit higher education. Then the third point I want to mention is, again, speaking of training and forming citizens and leaders for global engagement in the context of higher education, I believe that that goal cannot be satisfied by creating institutions that become, I would say, citadels of academic and intellectual self-gratification, in the sense that in the context of the developing world, and the one which I speak for more appropriately, the aim of Jesuit higher education has also to include engagement, constructive engagement with empowering potential action for social, economic, political change and development. In other words, to borrow again the idea of Arturo Sosa when he speaks about the Jesuit involvement in higher education, the prevalent aspiration for higher education in my part of the world really has to double as a project of social transformation. And so, in this context of celebrating the centennial of SFS, I have become convinced that this dream is not an impossible dream, and that there is, in fact, a model that demonstrates that over a century, drawing on the values and the ideals of the Jesuit company, so to speak, it is possible to deliver on that objective of forming engaged citizens and leaders for a better world. And if that world means a more peaceful, a more just, a more equitable, a more reconciled world, I think that's something we all want to be engaged in.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for inspirational testimonies, remarks to our topic, but also calls to action for SFS and for Georgetown and for the wider network. I'm tempted to ask you a few more questions myself, but I feel like, especially after this last presentation, it'd be good to open it up to engage all of you in the conversation, see where our discussion goes. So we have at least one roving mic. And as we did during our first session, if you stand up and introduce yourself and pose a question for one or more of the panelists, we can follow the thread of the conversation. Right here? Yeah. Just be patient, we're bringing around a microphone because we are recording this. Right here in the first row in the second section. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your remarks. My name is Kristen Malia. I'm an SFS graduate, and I currently teach Mediterranean migration to largely American university study abroad students in the south of Italy. And my question is, how do we create a more meaningful and sustainable relationship between the study abroad student and the host community? Oftentimes we take for granted the intrinsic value of the study abroad experience for the student, but is it valuable for the host community? And how do we increase that value while also respecting the rite of passage that study abroad is for the American university student?
Well, that's a question that could be answered in different ways. It's a very important question that we've tackled historically in different ways. At Georgetown, we've had a philosophy of really, and you might know this, embedding students within the culture, within the universities, not having a sort of customized international curriculum with other foreign nationals converging on a particular country or capital, but being fully enrolled within the university, and there are opportunities there for social justice, for engaging with the community. But how to program that and how to think about how to support that in creative ways is a current and important challenge. And I'm wondering, Father Robitor, if you could respond to that from the point of view of the developing world. When students come in to learn and engage in dialogue, they want to do good. And I think the implication of the question was good intentions is not always enough. So what kinds of institutional ways might we imagine a more productive dialogue and engagement with local cultures? And Danny, maybe you can weigh in there as well.
Oh. Yeah. Well, I think just the idea of going abroad, the very idea itself, irrespective of what the outcome is projected to be, for me is a a positive way of engaging with the world. It is a positive way of opening people's eyes to the reality that is beyond. And there would always be, I believe, certain moments of learning, certain moments of discovery, of revelation of what the world out there looks like. I have been in situations, not once, not twice, not thrice, in the global north, shall we say, when I have introduced myself as coming from Nigeria, and my interlocutor wants to talk to me about his friend in Sierra Leone or her friend in South Africa. Okay, so you get the point I'm making. Just so there is a lot of learning that needs to happen, and I think programs like this by themselves enable that kind of learning. But here's where I think things can become a bit more mutual. We talked about mutuality. I think it's preparing the student or the guest to realize that there is knowledge and wisdom already preceding that experience. I see this all the time when I travel, do international trips, and I see plane loads of people either going to Kenya or coming back to do mission, all kinds of mission, from evangelism to healthcare to development and all of that. I would like to say it's important that we prepare our students to realize that when they enter into this experience, there is a lot already of wisdom, of knowledge that they can draw. And quite often it's about not bringing new solutions, but actually trying to empower homegrown responses to challenges.
I'm talking from the perspective of international volunteers that we prepare to work in our projects on the field. And for example, if that helps, we don't promote short-term volunteer. We prepare them for a year before they go for 2 years. That's the level of intensity, and the training is mainly based on my own motivations to go and go deep on my own personal reasons to get into that exposure. So that's the first step into another level of training that is actually about the encounter with the different. It's a whole world, the idea of collaboration with others, and echoing the intuitions of Orobator. For me, the key, and that's what I always tell them before they go, is they are joining processes, histories, cultures that are already going on, and they will be going on when they are gone. And the whole point is not about myself, it's about meeting and learning with the people who is already there. I don't know if this helps, but if we don't find horizontality in the relations, we never let the guy or the lady go to the field, because it totally changes the way we work with the people locally.
I just want to go back to an experience I had as a freshman at Georgetown back in the Stone Age, when we weren't really as sophisticated as we are now about how to do these programs. And I spent a summer in Mexico working in a barrio. There were a number of us students. It was a student-led process. It was stitched together, but we all lived with families, and we all learned from those families and from the broader community that they brought together. It was one of the richest experiences, because going back to your point about not going into a place assuming you have all of the answers and know everything, but really coming out of it being so enriched, in fact, having been given far more than anything any of us thought we were going to give in terms of those kinds of projects, is the most important kinds of learning, I think. So to the extent that we can enrich these opportunities in that way, it benefits the student immeasurably. It also helps those with whom our students live and work. We've introduced many of the students to Women Peace Builders, as Father Curran said earlier, and they come back transformed by those experiences because you learn the book, you learn what you think is the current reality, but you have no idea what it's really like. And there's nothing like that hands-on, firsthand experience to know what one goes through, to know what they bring, to know what the impediments are in their path, and then to know as a student what I can be doing to have impact long after my graduation from Georgetown to really make a difference in those conditions. So I think it's a really important experiential time, both for the student and for the communities that host these students.
Thank you. Questions? There's one up here. Do we have the microphone? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to not have my back to anybody for a second. Hi, I'm Jonathan Bailiff, MSFS 95. I represent with Scheherazade the graduate programs. I'm on the board of advisors. Thank you, Tom, for getting me in last minute. My question is for Ambassador. You know, MSFS now has its first woman director. It only took, and if people don't know, MSFS, the master's program, was the first master's program in foreign service in the United States, maybe even the world, I think. This program didn't exist when I went to school at Georgetown. What can alumni do for your program? It's a fairly new program compared to others. And, you know, I always ask Nancy McEldowney, who's the new director of MSFS, what can alumni, graduate alumni, we get through the money talk fairly quickly, but there's things that the graduate students who I know want to take more of your programs, what can the alumni do to help you? I always ask that question at these functions because we always get more from you guys than sometimes we give. Thank you.
I think it's a wonderful question, and I would point to some of the extraordinary women in this room with whom I have had the privilege to work, all SFS alums who have become sort of pillars of the Institute in many ways, hosting events around the world, bringing people together, participating in ways that they bring their own backgrounds to and can enhance those learning experiences. We're looking at other ways in which the Georgetown Network, the Alumni Network, can be more intimately involved in these kinds of activities. One of my dreams is to take groups to places where we are working, whether it's in Liberia or it's in Northern Ireland or it's in Rwanda, et cetera, so that they can see firsthand what we're trying to do, experiencing it, and there's no telling with a Georgetown graduate what it will lead to. It opens far more doors and creates far more possibilities, but I think it's that lifelong learning process, not just benefiting Georgetown, but Georgetown's ongoing benefit to the rest of the world. So whether it's Sarah or Addie or Olga Maria or any of the great women in this room, they have been extraordinary partners. Scheherazade, I'm not going to, I started this and now I'm going to be in trouble of who I left out.
Thank you. I mean, just to, again, represent Nancy, Scheherazade, and the board of directors of the graduate schools of the School of Foreign Service are celebrating our 10th year. We have only existed 10 years as a board, which is pretty amazing when you think about the reach of the graduate students worldwide. And again, thank you for being invited and look forward to a great year.
Thank you. Further questions? There's a hand in the back. Yeah. Two hands back there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Samantha. I'm a relatively young graduate from the SFS, and I actually also went to the Gregoriana here in Rome. So I live here in Rome now, and I work for a nonprofit. So my question, I think everyone on the panel touched on like the leadership gap, right, and having a lack of formation. And I recognize that my question is going to come from a very like American perspective. But I think a leadership gap is not just a lack of formation, but it's the fact that students, my fellow students, are not choosing to go into public service in any way. They're not investing in the net. Well, I don't want to make too broad statements. I have a lot of wonderful friends, in case they're watching. But for the most part, they're not investing in public service. They're not investing in those Jesuit networks. They're frankly driven by like very practical concerns like student debt, et cetera, that we've all heard a lot about. And so my question is, what is missing in our formation worldwide that is not just a lack of access, but also there's something missing in the formation that we're not hearing that call to service. We're not hearing that call, I think, to investing in these sectors that you all have rightly talked about. I just feel like there's a really big gap there. I mean, frankly, when I was at Georgetown, again, not too long ago, I remember the only things at the Career Center that I really had access to were like consulting firms, which is not to say anything wrong with consulting firms, but I kind of feel like there's a bit of a disconnect, and I was wondering if you all could speak to that. Thank you.
I would be happy to begin. Yes.
The Citadels.
Thanks a lot for that great question. But you see, when I think leadership, in the way that I frame my contribution, I think leadership and citizenship in the way that, as I said, the Superior General of the Jesuits framed it for the higher education sector when he said it's about identifying with something that is bigger than the self, that is more encompassing than my own individual interests, which are always narrow and partial. And so in that framework, I see leadership as engagement in fields and sectors and platforms other than public service. And so what is missing, I think it's the ability or the intentionality of actually forming people in that understanding of what leadership is about. And it's not exhausted by public service. That in whatever field we engage in, and I think it's Joel who mentioned this, it's about making a difference. It's about making a difference, whether it's in business, whether it's in development, whether it's in public service, whether it's in community organizing. It's realizing that there is always a way of transforming or changing the situation. I think that's a message that still needs to come across much more, shall I say, intentionally.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the key messages is that no matter where we sit, we don't have to leave our day jobs if they're not in public life. We can make a difference, and each person has power to make a difference. And I hope some of that comes across in our education processes. But what I see in the students today is a tremendous interest in taking constructs that may not be viewed as service constructs as such, the private sector, and trying to figure out how can those tools be used to make a difference. We did a session not too long ago on how some of the major companies are investing in the developing world, particularly in creating economic opportunity for women. Some of it had to do through financial inclusion. Others of it had to do with training programs. Others had to do with moving women into their value chains, very poor women, and giving them an extraordinary sense of possibility and new life. So I agree, it's not just in the public life, although I would also say that our world today is screaming for leadership that can make a difference at that level. But I think our students really, many of them, it's very hard always to to universalize any statement, but I see them as very, very committed to trying to make a difference, however that difference is executed. You know, a number of CEOs have told me that when millennials come now to seek a job, the first thing they ask is not how much money am I going to make, but the first question is, I know your company makes widgets, but what's its real purpose? To be attached to something that has purpose. The second question is always, what's your policy on diversity? And more importantly, inclusion. If I am of the other, how do I feel in terms of being included in this network that I am potentially coming into? And then ways in which they can spend their lives beyond being tied to what the immediate task of the job is. But I do see this change, and I think it's broader than what we might think.
I think that was Coldenbach, the one who said that the real measure of the success of our schools is what our students become in the future. And I think that this is very, very, very interesting. Actually, all the reflection on global citizenship is trying to answer, I think, your question. For me, one of the keys is about how do you relate to the reality that is beyond your context and your direct experience. To what extent do you feel part of the human family? Why these people are your people and those are not, no? Or to what extent do you feel co-responsible of reality in the world, and how far it reaches what you feel is of your concern, where it starts something that it doesn't matter to you anymore. There are some philosophical questions that actually are questioning the concept of citizenship. You know, what is your city? What do you belong to? And what do you feel responsible of? And I think that if we start from primary education working on those values, hopefully we can get people really engaged with reality in a way that goes beyond their own self-interest and commitment with the common good that nowadays, as you say, is not as common as probably in other moments where values or frameworks were easy to understand and more maybe standard, or at least we knew only a few and it was easy to choose.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so let's gather these last three questions, and then the panel will respond to one or the other. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I'm Bogoni. I am the mom of one student of Georgetown, and I'm Italian. And my personal point of view is that since what I see, since I was young and now, that life is changed so badly because we are more focused on what we can get from our life instead of what we can give with our life. And I think that what is helping a lot now in Europe, and especially in Italy, to change this paradigm is UN agenda, as the ambassador said, because I went in the conference, that was the third conference a few days ago, here in Rome, for the Alliance for Sustainability, and even the governor of an Italian bank, from Banca d'Italia, for example, he was saying that they stopped to give money to companies that they have wonderful accounts, but they don't act well with their workers, with the pollution, with other things. So I think that the agenda, as the ambassador said, the UN agenda can really help to change this paradigm, and thinking that doing business or whatever act we do has an impact in many other fields, and this will guide, hopefully, us to a better world. Thank you.
Steve, in the back. And then there was a third question after that. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Steve Cashin, a long ago graduate. This has been fascinating. And I've worked with a number of you in the past, and I know that the efforts being made to move from my day when it was freeze breeze and quickly pass through the Jesuit tradition to really engage with the Jesuit tradition. Can you give us a little bit more about where you see Georgetown linked to the Jesuits globally within the next 10 years? Father Orbitar, you touched on universities in Africa. Milan has touched on the engagement of women's and women's engagement across much of the global world. I know that the Spanish have done an enormous amount in terms of integrating in both education and development across the world. And it'd be interesting to get your opinions on what the next 10 years brings us and how we can help to get there.
Thank you. And a final question. There was a third hand. Sarah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Thun-Hohenstein. And actually, my question is linked, I think, to yours. I was frankly shocked by the statistic that there are no Jesuit universities in Africa. And given that we have this leadership deficit across the world, so not just Africa, we heard that there are challenges within the network, within the Jesuit network, but what do we see as the solutions? And I was wondering, in that context of this argument, what is the position of Georgetown in helping bridge that gap? Whether it's more collaborations, raising awareness, I don't know. So I'd be very interested to hear your comments on that.
Great questions, forward-looking questions. We can only touch on them briefly here, but let's start with Father Robitor and move down the line with some concluding comments.
Yes. Yeah. And I would combine the response to both questions and say that the way I see it, and I'm speaking as an insider now in terms of my experience with Georgetown, is that Georgetown has already developed, I believe, over the century, what engaging with and tapping into the Jesuit tradition looks like. And that's already been explored and mentioned this evening. So that for me, it's not so much about trying to say, well, how can we engage with, how can we tap into, but rather how can we bring that model to develop and help develop other initiatives where these are needed. And so in the context of Africa, for example, as I said, there's a body, an accumulated body of wisdom, of experience in higher education across the Jesuit network. I think it would be hugely beneficial if that became available to help, to support, to empower initiatives that are geared towards establishing institutions of higher education, Jesuit institutions of higher education in the developing world.
To that point, let me concretize that a little bit. We have been doing some work at their request with Ibero-American University in Mexico. They got in touch with the Institute. This is a Jesuit university. They are on the cusp of really trying to address this whole issue of peace, addressing conflict, with a lens on gender participation, women's participation. They're dealing with horrific gang wars, which are tantamount to real wars. They're not included in the framework of, the way we identify wars, but that's what they're dealing with, whether it's Central America or Mexico, and a lot of the participants that they bring in are from the rest of the continent. And they're basically saying, can you help us with this? Because you are ahead of the game in many ways. You know what the research shows. You know who the players are. You know who we can bring to the table who can expound on this and help us get to a place where we want to get. So I think we could play more of that kind of role, which I think a little bit goes to the heart of what you were saying, which is it's always a two-way street, but one where we have the abilities to be much more available and useful to others in the global South. I think we need to be doing more between the North and the South. As hard as it may be, there's a richness there, and we owe it to each other in moving this mission forward. I would also just like to mention briefly what you in this room represent in many ways in the question about the alumni. I find with foreign service alums especially, women who, not just women, but men and women, but women in many of our missions around the world, the United States missions, an eagerness to take what they learned in the School of Foreign Service in terms of the service piece and ask repeatedly, what can they do to strengthen this agenda, for example. And we have had enormous numbers of alums and embassies come forward trying to understand how we can work together more effectively, because they have it in their interest representing their mission in terms of the United States, but also in terms of their personal engagement and involvement, hopefully not in conflict, to really take these shared values and express them and concretize them in better ways. So I think a better use of the role that our alumni play in ways that we have not really tapped it, but it is rich, it is extensive, and it is powerful.
So if you ask me about the role of Georgetown in the next 10 years regarding the Jesuit network and how can be the impact of it, my experience up to now is that it's been already life-changing. In my lifetime as a Jesuit, what I have seen happening is Georgetown acting as a, let's call it a convener of players at the apostolic landscape in a way that is unique, given probably the mixture of capabilities at the research level, also the connections at many levels, and also the resources available for experimenting initiatives, etc. That mixture creates opportunities for the apostolic mission of the society in a way that I haven't seen in other spaces. So I think that in the next 10 years we are going to see our global networks being strengthened at the sectorial level, universities, secondary ed, apostolic sectors like the social apostolate, and I hope that Georgetown can expand that kind of role, not just as Georgetown, but as a higher ed, offering that potential to the network of other apostolic secretariats. The only challenge I think we have is that Georgetown needs to be also ready to be part of something bigger than itself. And I think that's a challenge for us.
Thank you. Well, we've broached a wide range of issues that will be with us in the weeks, months, and years to come. We'll be able to continue the conversation informally over another coffee break, and in about 20 minutes, come back to hear Jose Casanova's keynote. But in closing, please join me in thanking the panelists.